The wind had turned sharp over the spires of Oxford that evening, carrying with it the faint chiming of bells and the shuffle of cloaks across the quadrangles. Within the oak-panelled sanctum of St. Anselm's College Library, the air was close and scented faintly of dust, vellum, and the faint metallic tang of old ink. At 9:30, Dr. Hubert Fenton, a mild scholar of medieval Latin manuscripts, was found lying face down upon the carpet of the restricted archives, his head resting unnaturally against the spine of a massive folio. A brass paper knife, its handle engraved with the college crest, had been thrust between his shoulder blades with such precision that he had neither risen nor called out. The discovery fell to Porter, the under-librarian, whose shriek echoed through the cloisters with such alarm that half the dons hurried from their lodgings before the porter's bell had even been rung. At first glance, the crime seemed brutally direct, even clumsy. A stabbing in an otherwise deserted library. Yet as the college doctor bent over the body, murmuring that death must have been instantaneous, it was the surroundings that struck every eye as singular. Fenton's desk, a tidy place by reputation, now presented a peculiar scene. His manuscript notes had been neatly stacked, untouched, save for a single leaf lying apart. A folio covered with an unfamiliar hand, jagged and hurried, as if written in haste. Beside it stood a locked glass case containing the college's most prized possession, a 15th-century Codex de Mortis Mysteries, whose iron clasps had been sealed only the week before. The case remained unbroken, the lock intact. The problem thickened when Porter stammered that no one could have entered the archive without a key. Only 3 existed: his own, Dr. Fenton's, and that of the warden. The windows, narrow as arrow slits, were fastened from within. The great oak door had been locked when Porter arrived and unlocked with his own key. The college clock struck the quarter as they examined it. Too soon for anyone to have slipped out unnoticed. In effect, Fenton had been murdered in a locked room under circumstances that made intrusion nearly impossible. The leaf of manuscript, which all had assumed belonged to Fenton, proved another source of perplexity. Its script was markedly unlike his hand, filled with eccentric flourishes and curious spelling, as though copied from some archaic source. Across the top margin, scrawled almost as an afterthought, stood a single Latin phrase: verba volunt, scripta manent. Words fly away, writings remain. No one could explain it, and the dons, whispering uneasily, speculated whether Fenton had stumbled on some hidden document, or whether the killer had left behind this cryptic relic as a deliberate taunt. The warden, a stern ecclesiastic of 60, with a lined face and penetrating gaze, declared that nothing had been removed from the case. The De Mortis Codex lay where it always had, a monstrous book of black leather with clasps the size of a man's hand. Yet Fenton had been engaged these past weeks in collating its marginalia, and it was whispered among his colleagues that he had grown uncharacteristically withdrawn, refusing to share his progress. "Secrecy ill becomes a scholar," muttered Dr. Millward, shaking his head as they gathered. If he had made some discovery, why hide it? No one answered. The college walls seemed to press in with their own silence, as if the centuries of cloistered learning frowned on such unseemly drama. When the police arrived, summoned from Oxford proper, the contradictions only multiplied. Inspector Arkwright, a stout man with sandy whiskers and a practical turn of mind, examined the knife, the body, and the desk with patient care. He could find no signs of struggle, no disturbance of the shelves, no footprints but Fenton's own. The window sills bore no marks of entry. The locked case defied tampering. It appeared absurdly simple. The victim stabbed in solitude with a weapon near at hand. and yet all the conditions made such solitude impossible to penetrate. "What of the note?" asked Arkwright, turning it over under the green, shaded lamp. "It is not his hand. You are all agreed." The dons nodded. The inspector grunted. "Then whoever wrote this was here tonight and left it behind. But how did he come and go? That is the question." Rumor spread swiftly beyond the college walls. By midnight, word had reached the inns along High Street and the taverns by the bridge. A don had been murdered in the library, and some said it was connected to witchcraft, others to treasure buried in the manuscripts. A few whispered that the codex itself was cursed, that its very pages spoke of death to those who read too closely. Scholars scoffed. Yet even among them a nervousness lingered. To kill a man with such precision and vanish from a locked room was not the act of chance or passion. It bore the stamp of calculation. The police, methodical but unimaginative, questioned the obvious figures, the under-librarian porter, whose hand still shook as he answered, the warden, who produced his key after a fumbling search in his cassock pocket, and Dr. Millward, who admitted to being Fenton's rival in academic circles, but denied any quarrel beyond the usual disputes of scholarship. Each possessed an alibi of sorts. Porter had been on duty at the Porter's Lodge until 9, the warden at chapel, Millward at a dinner in hall. All were vouched for, yet the impossible fact remained that someone had stood in that locked room with Fenton, knife in hand, and walked away unseen. By the time the body was removed and the archive sealed, the dons dispersed to their chambers with furrowed brows. The warden, in private aside to Arkwright, confessed that Fenton had requested an additional lamp for late night work only the week before, claiming he was on the verge of an important discovery in the codex. He had seemed nervous, even suspicious, about being observed. He feared, said the warden in a low voice, that someone might steal a march upon him. But whether in scholarship or in darker matters, I cannot say. The inspector made his notes muttering of locked doors, missing times, and odd scraps of Latin. Yet for all his patience, there was no thread to follow, no evidence beyond the inexplicable page and the obvious weapon. The case hung suspended, neither yielding nor advancing, like one of those puzzles in which every piece fits too neatly and thus conceals its true design. It was into this atmosphere, half-scholarly suspicion, half-whispered dread, that a telegram was dispatched the next morning. Its wording was brief, formal, and without ornament, but it bore the quiet desperation of a man who knows he has encountered something beyond his grasp. To Lord Peter Wimsey. Urgent assistance required. Unsolvable crime, locked room, college library. Murder most perplexing. Come at once. And so the stage was set, with a murdered scholar, a cryptic manuscript leaf, and an archive that defied intrusion, an affair either too simple or impossibly complex. It waited now for the arrival of one who could read in its contradictions the pattern of design, the hidden hand that had written, not merely upon the page, but upon the very air of St. Anselm's itself. Lord Peter Wimsey arrived at Oxford in the grey chill of morning, his motorcar scattering a few early undergraduates across the cobbles as he swung into the quad with a jauntiness that belied the hour. He stepped lightly out, monocle glinting, his manner as nonchalant as though he had come to inspect a wine list rather than a murder. Yet beneath the air of flippancy, his sharp blue eyes took in the college's mood at once as the subdued hush, the curious faces half withdrawn behind curtains, the porter's nervous fiddling with his cap, a place accustomed to silence, but not this sort of silence. Inspector Arkwright, waiting stolidly in the cloisters, greeted him with a touch of wary respect. He had worked with Wimsey before, and though he would never openly admit it, He found the man's airy chatter a useful foil for his own dog procedure. "Glad you could come, my lord. It's a nasty business. Straightforward stabbing, but wrapped up in a puzzle box of doors and keys." "Delicious," said Whimsy lightly, straightening his tie. "Way locked room mystery, and at my old college too. Nothing so bracing as murder before breakfast. Lead on, my dear inspector." They passed into the library, now chill with the windows shuttered and the dust unsettled by too many feet. The scene had been preserved as far as possible. Chalk marked where the body had lain. The paper knife rested under glass on the table, and the curious manuscript leaf was pinned between slips of cardboard. Whimsy strolled about with the air of a man in search of a misplaced umbrella, humming a little tune as he bent over the desk, then straightened, then stooped again with sudden intent. Fenton was no sloven, he murmured. "Neat hand, neat piles. Yet observe this leaf, slightly crooked against the grain of the others. Almost tossed there, wouldn't you say? As if written in haste. But why only one? And why in a hand so unlike his own?" He leaned closer, sniffed, and produced a handkerchief. Ink still faintly pungent. Not more than a day old. Curious, considering Fenton was copying a 15th century codex. And odder still, this is modern paper, machine cut. The rest of his notes are on college stationery. But this, bought from a stationer in town, if I'm not mistaken. Not part of the scholarly set at all. Our murderer, Inspector, may have left us a calling card in his eagerness. Arkwright grunted. "You make it sound like carelessness or arrogance," said Whimsy. He tapped the Latin phrase with his finger. "Words fly away, writings remain. A scholar's jest or a threat? Let us not assume too soon." He turned toward the locked case and bent down, peering at the iron clasps. "Unbroken." "You say, tested it myself?" said Arkwright. "No marks, no scratches. Key fits clean." Whimsy smiled faintly. "And yet see here, on the wood beneath the lock. A faint smudge, grace perhaps. Not from the dons, I fancy. They'd sooner touch the host with unwashed hands. Someone pressed here, though not roughly. More the action of steadying oneself. And very faint dust displaced along the edge. Someone lingered near this case. Perhaps in reverence, perhaps in theft. But the book remains. Unless," he tilted his head, "unless what lies within is not what it seems. Have you had the codex examined?" The inspector shook his head. "We've sealed it for now. Wise, but we may need a specialist eye. Books, like people, sometimes wear disguises." As they spoke, the under-librarian porter was summoned once more. He entered pale and nervous, his spectacles fogged from the damp. Whimsy gave him a disarming smile. "Good morning, porter. Nasty shock last night. Tell me, when you found Dr. Fenton, did you notice anything unusual besides the obvious?" Porter wrung his hands. "Only that the door was locked, my lord. I swear I opened it myself with my own key. No one could have gone in or out, and the room was so still like a tomb. I nearly fainted." Yes, perfectly understandable. And when you saw the desk, did you observe that loose sheet?" "I did, my lord. I thought it odd, but assumed it was his." Whimsy's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "But you knew his hand, surely. You've catalogued his notes often enough." Porter flushed. "Why, yes, my lord. But I was too shaken to think clearly." "Forgive me." Whimsy let the matter drop with a careless wave, but Arkwright caught the glint in his eye. There was something about Porter's quick excuse, the way his voice cracked, that suggested more than mere nerves. Later in the cloister, Whimsy turned to Arkwright. "Our friend Porter noticed the script but chose not to remark on it until pressed. Natural, perhaps, but my instincts say otherwise. A small deception. the sort men make when they wish to appear less knowing than they are. Arkwright frowned. You suspect him? Not yet. I merely observe the twitch of the curtain. Whether it hides guilt or fear remains to be seen. But remember, small lies often point to larger truths. At luncheon in hall, whimsy mingled with the dons, drawing out their chatter with a careless wit that belied the sharpness of his listening. Dr. Millward, in particular, could not resist expounding upon his rivalry with Fenton, though he masked it with scholarly disdain. The man was secretive to a fault. One might almost think he fancied himself the discoverer of some great mystery. But scholarship, my lord, is not a treasure hunt. No, said Whimsy, sipping his wine. And yet men have killed for less than the privilege of footnotes. Tell me, did Fenton confide in you, perhaps boast of his progress? Millward gave a dry laugh. Confide. He would rather choke. He locked his notes away and worked at hours no man could guess. Though I did hear him in the library as late as midnight a week ago, muttering to himself. I assumed he was rehearsing a lecture. Midnight. Whimsy's eyebrow rose. The library locked, yet he within? Curious indeed. The warden, overhearing, interjected stiffly. Dr. Fenton was permitted special access, Lord Peter. He believed he was on the verge of something remarkable. He spoke to me of hidden layers, though what he meant I could not divine. He seemed uneasy. I attributed it to academic strain. Whimsy tucked the remark away, even as he offered some light jest about scholars driven mad by footnotes. Yet the phrase, hidden layers, clung in his mind, fitting oddly with the untouched codex and the solitary leaf of modern paper. Something about the arrangement struck him as too neat, too deliberately puzzling. That afternoon, he returned alone to the library and seated himself at the desk where Fenton had last worked. He spread the sheet before him, monocle fixed, and studied it afresh, a hurried hand, ink fresh, paper modern, and at the corner, a tiny smear faint, but visible under the glass, not ink, but wax, red wax. Whimsy leaned back, whistling softly. Wax suggested a seal. A letter perhaps from which this leaf had been torn. But why tear, and why leave it here? Unless the murderer wished it to be found. Unless it was meant as a message. As he pondered, a shadow fell across the threshold. Porter stood there, clutching his cap. Beg pardon, my lord, he stammered, but I remembered something. Dr. Fenton. He received a parcel last week, brown paper, tied with string. He seemed agitated, told me it was nothing of consequence. But I saw wax on the wrapping when he opened it. Red wax, like you see on old letters. He burned the paper after in the grate. Whimsy's eyes gleamed. My dear Porter, that is not nothing, it is everything. And I rather think Dr. Fenton opened a door that someone else was determined to close, with a knife in the back for punctuation. The Manuscript of Murder. Inspector begins to take shape. Lord Peter sat that evening in the warden's drawing-room. A mellow fire burning in the grate and the scent of old tobacco clinging to the curtains. The dons, summoned at his request, were gathered in stiff, backed chairs, each looking as though he resented both the summons and the shadow of suspicion it implied. Inspector Arkwright loomed in the corner with his notebook, prepared to take down the words, while Whimsy, sprawled with easy grace on a low armchair, conducted his inquiry with the languid manner of a man arranging after-dinner conversation. Yet behind his idle questions, every word was a probe, testing for weakness in the fabric of their accounts. He began with Dr. Millward, the rival. Tell me again, sir, about your evening at Hall. Whimsy said, lazily polishing his monocle. What time did you leave the table? About 8:30, said Millward crisply. I remained in conversation until nearly 9, when I retired to my rooms to prepare for a lecture. Several fellows can attest to my presence. Indeed. And you heard nothing unusual in the quadrangle? No hurried footsteps, no sound from the library. Millward shook his head with impatient finality. Nothing whatever. I was occupied with my notes. Ah, the industrious scholar. Wimsey smiled faintly. Though you said earlier that Fenton was muttering in the library late at night, did you not? How did you happen to hear him, if you were so diligently cloistered in your own chambers? Millward's lips thinned. Why, passed by on my way to chapel a week ago. His voice carried. That was all. The explanation was neat, but whimsy marked the flush in Millward's cheek. The quickness with which he supplied it. A small contradiction, perhaps easily smoothed, but it hinted at a man careful with appearances. Next, the warden. Your key, sir, always kept upon your person. In my cassock pocket, yes, the warden replied with grave dignity. I have not parted with it. Last night I was at chapel, and many can bear witness. Just so. And Dr. Fenton confided in you about hidden layers within the codex. Did he mention receiving any letters or parcels? The warden frowned slightly. He did not. Though now you say it, he seemed preoccupied when last we spoke. Distracted, almost fearful. I attributed it to the strain of research. But no. He told me nothing of parcels. Whimsy let the silence stretch. Odd, then, that Porter should recall one so vividly. The wax. The burning of the wrappings. It seems hardly trivial. The warden's eyes narrowed with faint displeasure. Perhaps Porter has embroidered his memory to make himself useful. Whimsy's smile sharpened, though he masked it with a soft laugh. Perhaps. Or perhaps the good librarian has less freedom to embroider than we suppose. Books do not lie, after all, though men may. He shifted his gaze to Porter, who sat rigidly at the edge of his chair, twisting his cap. Tell us, my dear fellow, did Dr. Fenton ever confide in you? Share what he worked upon? Porter hesitated, then blurted, only once, my lord. He said he had found something dangerous. I begged him to explain, but he only laughed and told me to mind the catalogue. That was 3 days before this happened. Arkwright leaned forward. Dangerous in what sense? Porter shook his head. I don't know. Truly. But he seemed frightened, as though he had uncovered something he wished he hadn't. Whimsy's eyes gleamed, though he asked lightly. And yet you said nothing to anyone until now. A curious omission, Porter. I was afraid. Porter stammered. Afraid it would sound mad. Afraid they'd think me gossiping. Too eager, Whimsy thought. The librarian's anxiety had the shape of truth, but the weight of concealment as well. His story rang genuine enough, yet his readiness to cast himself as the fearful bystander was almost rehearsed. When the dons had gone, Whimsy lingered with Arkwright by the dying fire. 3 men, 3 versions, he murmured. Millward, evasive, the warden. Dignified but curiously blind to Fenton's parcel, Porter, eager to speak now, though silent before. Each conceals something. The trick will be to know which concealment conceals murder. The following day, Whimsy contrived private interviews, coaxing more by tone than interrogation. With Millward, he adopted the manner of an old-school fellow. You know, my dear man, it must be the deuce of a nuisance, having one's rival murdered. People will insist on seeing motives everywhere. Millward gave a bitter smile. Do they? Then they misjudge. Fenton and I quarreled over trifles, but never to the point of blood. Still, I won't deny it. He stood between me and a coveted lectureship. With him gone, some may think me advantaged. An honest admission, said Whimsy softly. Though perhaps a shade too honest. Almost as if you wished me to discard you at once. Millward's eyes flashed. I tell you plainly, I had no hand in it. Which was not the same as proving he had no knowledge. Whimsy left him with a bow, more suspicious of the man's vehemence than reassured by it. The warden, questioned later, grew defensive when asked about the codex itself. The manuscript is sacred to the college, Lord Peter. Its contents are not for idle curiosity. I shall not allow it to be pored over like a common ledger. Idle curiosity is my second, best virtue, said Whimsy amiably. But murder, dear sir, is hardly idle. Tell me, why such reluctance? Surely you wish the truth uncovered. The warden's mouth tightened. The truth lies in patience. Fenton's death must not sully the reputation of St. Anselm's. There are benefactors, traditions, delicate balances. You cannot expect me to expose our treasures to sensationalism. It was not fear of the Codex's secrets that showed in his tone, Whimsy thought, but fear of scandal, and scandal could make a man blind to what he ought to reveal. When Porter returned to the library later that afternoon, Whimsy waylaid him with apparent carelessness. Thought, Porter, this parcel, did you happen to notice the handwriting on the paper before it was burned? Porter's eyes darted nervously. No, my lord. Only the wax. I swear it. Curious, because brown paper retains impressions even after burning. If a man has scratched upon it, you did not see a mark. An address? Perhaps. Porter swallowed hard. If I did, I cannot remember, cannot, or will not. Porter's lips trembled, but he said no more. Whimsy let him go, smiling faintly. There it was again, the subtle lie, the hesitation that betrayed knowledge kept back. Not guilt, perhaps, but fear. Fear of what, or whom, remained to be seen. That night, strolling the cloisters beneath the moon, Whimsy pieced together the fragments. Each man had spoken, and each had in his way deceived. Millward's alibi was convenient, his admissions too practiced. The warden's dignity masked a reluctance to permit inquiry into the very heart of the matter. Porter, for all his nervous truth, was holding something still, some detail he dared not utter. 3 voices, each discordant, each shadowed by deception. Somewhere among them lay the pattern, the faint design behind the locked door, the manuscript leaf, the parcel with red wax. Whimsy's lips curled into a smile. A tangle, yes, but tangles, when teased with patience, have a way of yielding their knots. The bells of St. Anselm's struck 10 as Lord Peter Whimsy paced slowly along the deserted quadrangle, the mist curling round the cloisters like a living veil. He was thinking of voices. Millward's bitterness cloaked in forced frankness, the warden's dignity concealing unease. Porter's tremulous evasions, and behind each voice a motive, a shadowy shape that might stretch into murder. Yet none of them fit neatly. Each motive seemed plausible, but none complete. The case had all the perplexity of a puzzle with too many pieces. He began to test them in turn, as one might turn a key in several locks, hoping one would yield. Millward rivalry, ambition, the prospect of advancement. With Fenton gone, the lectureship was his for the taking. And Millward had admitted as much, though with too much candor, as if to inoculate himself against suspicion. But the crime bore precision, calm, exacting, and carefully staged with its locked doors and cryptic note. Millward's temper was sharp, his intellect keen. But was he the sort of man to leave behind so theatrical a clue? Whimsy doubted it. A jealous scholar might stab, but he would not compose enigmas in Latin. The warden guardian of the college's honor, fearful of scandal, unwilling to expose the codex to examination. His motive, then, was not personal gain but preservation. The reputation of St. Anselm's, the sanctity of its relics. If Fenton had uncovered something dangerous, something that might cast shame upon the college, might the warden have silenced him? It was possible. But the act did not ring true. The warden's fear was genuine, but it was fear of discovery, not fear of Fenton. He would conceal, obstruct, even dissemble, but kill. Wimsey was not convinced. And Porter, the nervous underling, too eager to please, too frightened to speak freely. What motive could be his? Fear, perhaps. If he had stumbled upon knowledge, seen or overheard something that night, he might have reason to conceal it now. But fear is not in itself a motive for murder, it is a motive for silence. Unless, of course, Fenton had threatened him, or discovered some petty theft, some misdeed. Yet that seemed a thin thread to bind so neat a killing. As he turned these thoughts, Wimsey's steps brought him to the darkened library. The door was barred, the windows shuttered, but he stood a moment gazing up at its tower, where centuries of learning brooded in silence. Somewhere within those walls, amid the dust of manuscripts and the smell of ink, lay the heart of the matter. Fenton had died over a book, or something bound within it, and the web of motives was strung about that hidden core. The following morning, Wimsey requested to see Fenton's rooms. The small chambers overlooked the garden, their walls lined with books and papers, the desk littered with notes. He moved with the delicacy of a man examining a chessboard, eyes flitting from object to object. A half-burnt stub of ceiling, wax in the grate caught his eye, red and of the same shade Porter had described. Nearby, a scrap of brown string. No sign of the parcel itself remained. Yet on the desk, beneath a heap of manuscripts, Wimsey found something more suggestive, a small notebook, written in Fenton's neat hand. Most of it contained lists of references, marginalia, cross-references to the codex. But at the back, a single entry stood out, written more hastily than the rest, hidden within, beneath the glosses. Truth not meant for eyes of men. If known, it would shake the very name of Anselm. The date was 3 days before his death. Wimsey tapped the page thoughtfully. Hidden layers indeed. A discovery that would tarnish the college's sainted name, and which, therefore, might make enemies of his colleagues. Yes, Inspector. There is motive enough here: ambition, preservation, fear. But who was willing to put a knife in his back? Arkwright grunted. Each of them. By the look of it. Millward to get his post. The warden to keep the codex untouched. Porter because he knew too much, or was made to fear exposure. Precisely, said Wimsey. A motive maze with each path leading plausibly to the center, but none quite reaching it. Too many reasons, too many deceptions. Our task is to find the motive that fits not only the man but the method. At luncheon that day, Wimsey probed further. He drew Millward into talk of the lectureship, asking with an air of banter whether he expected the appointment soon. Millward replied with forced modesty, but his eyes gleamed at the prospect. Jealousy, then, was real enough. Yet when Wimsey steered the subject to Fenton's supposed discovery, Millward grew curt. I cannot say what fantasies the man indulged. He liked to exaggerate, which was a contradiction. Earlier he had spoken of hearing Fenton mutter about some great secret, yet now he dismissed it. A convenient forgetting, or a deliberate retreat. With the warden, Wimsey changed tack, speaking gently of the codex. Suppose, sir, Fenton had indeed found something damaging to the college name. Would you not rather have known of it, to prepare your defense? The warden stiffened. I would rather such things had never been sought. Curiosity is a dangerous indulgence. His words came quickly, too quickly, and Wimsey saw in them not mere disapproval but alarm. A man more concerned with suppression than truth. A motive born not of malice but of dread. And Porter, when approached in the library later, proved still more entangled. Wimsey, bending over a catalogue with feigned casualness, remarked, "Funny thing about parcels, Porter. One wonders who sent it, eh? Might have been a friend, or an enemy? Porter's face twitched. I don't know. My lord, I swear I don't. But Fenton burned the paper, Whimsy said softly. Burned it quick, before anyone might see. And you helped him tidy, didn't you? Picked up a scrap or two. Perhaps saw a name. Porter's hands trembled. I daren't say. Please don't press me. Daren't. Whimsy lifted a brow. That is stronger than cannot. What spectre frightens you into silence, Porter? A scholar's rivalry, the warden's wrath, or something else entirely? Porter only shook his head, and Whimsy let him go, knowing the silence spoke louder than words. The man was trapped in fear of someone's hand, and that fear was motive enough to withhold the truth. By evening, the threads lay tangled in Whimsy's mind. Millward with his envy, the warden with his dread of scandal, Porter with his fearful knowledge. Each motive plausible, each alibi imperfect. Yet still the locked room mystery remained unsolved, the how as puzzling as the why. And then, as he stood again before the glass case of the codex, Whimsy's eyes fell once more on the faint smear of grease he had noted earlier. A hand had pressed there, steadying itself, perhaps while slipping something in or out. What if the codex was not untouched, but subtly altered? What if Fenton's discovery lay not in his own notes, but in something slipped among its pages, something someone wished hidden or exposed? The motive maze narrowed suddenly to a single point. Whatever secret the codex contained was the key. Greed, fear, jealousy, all circled about it, until he uncovered that hidden layer. The maze would remain unsolved. Whimsy straightened, the glint in his eye sharper now. Inspector, he murmured, we must look inside the book. Our murderer has written his motive there. Inspector Arkwright's patience, already tested by Whimsy's insistence on subtlety, gave way to satisfaction when the codex was finally opened under careful supervision. The clasps, stiff with age, creaked as the warden reluctantly provided the key. Within, the black letter text lay as expected, its margins filled with crabbed glosses, some in Latin, some in Greek. But as the leaves turned, Arkwright's keen eye, not Whimsy's, lit upon something startling. A sheet not vellum but modern paper had been neatly inserted among the folios. Unlike the cryptic leaf found on Fenton's desk, this one bore a name written boldly across the top: Millward. The inspector gave a triumphant grunt. There we are, my lord. A false hand planting clues in the manuscript, and our victim about to expose it. Millward had every reason to silence him. The dons present gasped, even the warden looked shaken. Whimsy, however, merely lifted his monocle and examined the sheet with cool detachment. Indeed, very damning at first glance. A forged commentary attributed to our friend Millward, tucked neatly where Fenton would find it. And if exposed, the fellow's career would have been in tatters. Convenient, wouldn't you say? Arkwright pressed his advantage, ordering Millward to account for himself. The scholar flushed scarlet, stammered denials, and swore he had never laid eyes on the page. His indignation rang genuine, yet his manner, quick, defensive, overwrought, gave the inspector all the assurance he needed. By afternoon, Millward's rooms had been searched, revealing a small cache of red sealing wax and string in a drawer. The announcement spread swiftly. The police had their culprit. Millward, envious of Fenton's rising star, had forged a commentary in his rival's name, concealed it in the codex, and when discovered, silenced him with a knife. The red wax and string matched Porter's recollection of the mysterious parcel. The motive was plain, the method plausible. By evening, whispers through the quadrangles spoke of justice all but achieved. Whimsy, however, reclined in his chair at the inn and frowned into his glass of port. It was too neat, too symmetrical. My dear inspector, he remarked earlier with a faint smile. "You have tied the bow beautifully. Only, I fear it may strangle the wrong neck." For what troubled him was not Millward's indignation, nor even the suspicious discovery of wax and string, but the manner of the planted page itself. It was too obvious. A scholar intent on forgery does not scrawl a name in bold letters, leaving the evidence practically signed. Nor would such a man slip his false work into a codex under lock and key, knowing it could be traced at once. The act was a frame-up, calculated with cruel neatness to point suspicion in one direction. Wimsey retraced his mental steps. The parcel were burned in Fenton's grate. Could it have contained the false leaf? If so, then the murderer had planted it deliberately, knowing Fenton would uncover it. But why leave a second sheet on the desk, cryptic, hurried, bearing the Latin motto? That was not Millward's work, that was something else entirely, meant to confuse. One piece accused, the other missiled. Together they made too much of a performance. Still, the authorities pressed forward. Arkwright, buoyed by his apparent success, prepared to charge Millward. The dons, eager for resolution, murmured agreement. The warden himself sighed with relief, as though the burden of scandal might be lifted at last. Only Wimsey, strolling the cloisters at twilight, felt the chill of unease. He paused where the shadows fell thickest and considered. If Millward were guilty, why not destroy the false page once Fenton discovered it? Why murder in a manner so conspicuous? A stabbing in the locked library, a planted manuscript leaf, a cryptic note. These were not the tools of a desperate man, but of one who wished to orchestrate a drama. The real criminal was playing with appearances, arranging a tableau in which Millward's guilt would be inevitable. Yet there was something more sinister. If the false evidence had been meant to satisfy the authorities, it suggested the murderer was not finished. He was confident enough to let Millward hang while he remained concealed. And such confidence meant he was close, still within the college walls, perhaps watching every move with cool amusement. That night Wimsey dined with Arkwright in the inn's parlour. The inspector, flushed with certainty, spoke of drawing up formal charges. "We've got him dead to rights, my lord. Motive means opportunity. And if you'll forgive me, your reluctance sounds like over-refinement. Sometimes the blunt facts are best." Wimsey smiled thinly. "Blunt facts, dear inspector, have a way of bruising the wrong man. Ask yourself who benefits most from Fenton's silence. Millward, yes, but also the warden, who dreaded scandal, Porter, who knew too much, and perhaps another hand yet unseen. Our murderer has written a play, and you, sir, are applauding before the final act." The inspector grumbled, but Wimsey let the matter rest. He had no proof, only instinct and a pattern too symmetrical to be true. But his instincts had rarely failed him. The following morning, the dons awoke to the sound of rumors spreading faster than the chapel bell. Millward had protested his innocence so vehemently that some began to doubt. Porter, pale and wan, muttered to anyone who would listen that he knew Millward was being wronged, though when pressed he offered no reason. The warden, meanwhile, grew colder, urging that the matter be concluded quickly before scandal spread further afield. Wimsey walked the library once more, alone in the grey light, and felt the weight of the codex under his hand. It was not Millward's clumsy scrawl that mattered, nor the red wax, nor even the knife. It was the hidden layer Fenton had hinted at, the truth beneath the glosses. Whatever secret lay buried in those pages had cost a man his life. And until that secret was uncovered, the false victory of Millward's arrest would stand as nothing more than a clever disguise for murder. He leaned closer to the glass case, whispering to himself, "The true hand has not yet played its card. And when it does, We must be ready, or there will be another death to follow. The morning after Millward's supposed disgrace dawned heavy with mist, the kind of damp that clung to the stones of Oxford and made even the most solid towers seem like phantoms. Wimsey lingered in the cloisters, pipe in hand, while the rest of the college buzzed with talk of the impending charge. His mind circled the matter like a hawk unwilling to strike until it had seen the whole field. The false leaf, the burned parcel, the cryptic scrap, all too pat. He felt himself gnawed by the sense of some older shadow stretching its fingers into the present crime. When he finally returned to the library, he paused again before the great codex. He traced his finger along the glosses, half to distract himself, half in the hope that some overlooked detail might rise from the vellum. And then, as the faint light struck the margins, he noticed something others had dismissed, a small note in Greek, copied in a hand that was decidedly not medieval. Someone in the last century, perhaps even later, had scrawled a commentary, now faded almost to illegibility. Wimsey bent closer. The date below it read 1865. That year pricked his memory. There had been a scandal at Oxford in the mid-Victorian period, an affair of forged manuscripts that had ruined a promising dun. The details were buried in old archives, but Wimsey's brain, attuned to such eccentric corners of history, seized on the echo. What if the present forgery, the planted leaf, was not an isolated invention but a revival of an older deceit? He left the library at once and sought out the college archivist, a timid fellow named Lathbury, who spent more time among dust than daylight. After a little coaxing and the application of Lord Peter's most persuasive charm, Lathbury unearthed a small packet of papers bound in faded blue. The scandal of 1865, he explained nervously, had involved a scholar named Carstone, who claimed to have discovered lost scholia in a medieval codex, only for it to be revealed they were his own fabrications. The affair had rocked the college and been quietly suppressed, but Carstone's career was destroyed. Wimsey read the brittle papers with mounting interest. Carstone had not acted alone. Another name appeared repeatedly, George Millward, great-uncle to the present suspect. And alongside him, a junior fellow of the college, later risen to warden. Wimsey lifted his brows. "Ah," he murmured. "So our present company is bound by more than just collegial ties. Blood and reputation are chained to a scandal long buried. And now that scandal has crawled back into the daylight." When he shared the discovery with Arkwright, the inspector scoffed. "What's past is past, my lord. The sins of the fathers don't excuse the son's knife." But Wimsey shook his head. "You miss the pattern. The name Millward was smeared then, as now. Carstone's forgery destroyed him, and now another forgery, clumsy, theatrical, seeks to do the same. Our murderer has an eye for symmetry. Inspector, he is staging a repetition, a grim echo of history. That's no accident." Wimsey's suspicion deepened when he returned to Porter. The secretary, pale and shivering as if from perpetual fever, seemed almost relieved when Wimsey mentioned the Carstone scandal. His lips trembled. I had wondered, my lord, whether it was coming round again. I found a scrap in the warden's papers weeks ago, Carstone's name. The word forgery, but I dared not ask. He warned me never to pry. And then Dr. Fenton came to me with his discovery. There it was. The chain tightened. Fenton had uncovered something in the codex that pointed back to the old scandal. He had perhaps intended to reveal that the forgery of 1865 was not Carstone's alone. If the warden's name, or the Millwards, or another Doane's family, was implicated, the shame would rise anew. That explained the terror in the warden's eyes, the eagerness to bury matters quickly, the feverish way Millward had been pushed forward as scapegoat. But it also raised another question: who had revived the past? The present forgery, with its bold scrawl and clumsy placement, had been done by a modern hand. Someone had deliberately invoked the name Millward, echoing the past scandal to frame him now. Was it vengeance for the old affair? Or was it a stratagem to bury deeper guilt? To draw suspicion elsewhere while the real criminal kept his hands clean? Whimsy's mind ticked over the possibilities. Millward, though hot-headed and envious, seemed too blunt for such intricate theatre. Porter, weak and pliable, might be manipulated but scarcely capable. The warden, with his old ties to the affair, had motive enough. But his manner was too cautious, too calculating for so reckless a stage play. And yet, wasn't caution the very reason one might frame another so extravagantly? That evening, as Whimsy sat in his rooms, he sifted the echoes of 1865 against the present murder. Both involved a codex, both a forgery planted where it would be discovered, both scandals threatening reputations. The difference was that in the past, the forgery had been exposed. Now, the forgery had been used as a weapon to kill. The symmetry was too deliberate. Someone had read the record of Carstone's disgrace and chosen to reenact it as murder. What sealed Whimsy's unease was a final note in the archive packet. Carstone, ruined and disgraced, had died within the year. Some whispered he had not acted alone, that he had borne the punishment while another escaped. The papers hinted darkly that the truth had been concealed. For the honor of the college. Whimsy set down the document and tapped his fingers against his knee. So that is it. Fenton found the old sin, buried in the codex itself, and our murderer feared exposure, not merely of a forgery, but of a legacy. This crime is not of today only. It is the past returned with a knife in its hand. He leaned back, exhaling smoke toward the ceiling. The inspector might call the case solved, but Whimsy knew better. The shadow of Carstone, the echo of 1865, had crept into the present. Until that shadow was named and banished, the true murderer still walked free. And worse, he thought grimly, the murderer was not finished. The symmetry of the play demanded another act, and Whimsy must be ready before the curtain rose again. Whimsy did not sleep that night. He paced the narrow length of his rooms, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the thick college carpets, his mind rehearsing the pieces of the puzzle with the restless energy of a man who knew the truth was near, but not yet in hand. The past and present overlapped too neatly for coincidence. Whoever had killed Fenton was not merely protecting a present reputation, but replaying an old drama, twisting it into a more sinister form. And if that was the case, the usual methods of interrogation, of weighing alibis and cross-examining testimonies, would never suffice. He needed a way to draw the murderer out, not by force, but by craft. It was in that hour, when the mist pressed thickly against the leaded windows, that an idea came to him. Scholars lived and breathed by texts. The codex was their theatre, their battlefield, their obsession. If the murderer had staged this crime as an echo of Carstone's scandal, then perhaps the codex itself could be made to betray him. A forgery could be faked, a story could be rehearsed. But the guilty mind, when confronted with the ghost of its own handiwork, might falter. The next morning he requested a gathering in the library, under pretext of conducting a final review of the manuscript before the authorities removed it for further safekeeping. The warden, Millward, Porter, and even Inspector Arkwright were present, though the inspector grumbled at the waste of time. Whimsy placed the great codex on its lectern, open not to the disputed leaf, but to the margin where the faint Greek commentary of 1865 lingered, half invisible. "Gentlemen," Whimsy began, his voice light, even flippant, though his eyes were sharp as a falcon's, Or trouble here is a difficulty of authorship. The ancients, the medieval scribes, our modern scholars, all have left their mark, some genuine, some otherwise. It strikes me that one way of cutting through the fog is to ask who recognizes what does not belong. He tapped the faded Greek scrawl. Here we have the note of a scholar, mid-19th century. Most men would pass it by without a thought. But one familiar with the Carstone affair might recognize its significance at once. He let the silence hang, then added casually, "I should like each of you, in turn, to look upon it and tell me what you see." It was an absurd exercise, half parlor game, half trap. Arkwright rolled his eyes but said nothing. Millward scowled, peered, and muttered that it was nothing more than Hall's scribbles. Probably a gloss. Porter trembled, his breath catching audibly, and whispered, "It looks like a note a later hand, perhaps." Whimsy nodded, non-committal, before turning at last to the warden. The old man bent stiffly, adjusted his spectacles, and glanced at the page. For the briefest instant, no more than the flicker of a candle guttering in a draught, his composure cracked. His fingers tightened on the lectern edge. His lips drew back as though to form words hastily suppressed, and a flush spread across his pale cheeks. When he finally spoke, it was too measured, too careful, a marginal gloss of no relevance to our present inquiry. "I see no reason to dwell on it." Whimsy's eyes gleamed. He said nothing, only allowed the silence to stretch. The warden turned, as if to dismiss the exercise, but Whimsy moved swiftly, his voice casual yet edged with steel. "Interesting that you call it irrelevant, sir. For it is a note by one of Carstone's contemporaries, naming him directly as the forger. And, by association, another fellow implicated but never exposed. The handwriting, you see, matches a letter preserved in the archives, signed by a young don who later became warden of this very college." There was a faint intake of breath, a rustle of unease. Porter half collapsed into a chair, staring at his hands. Millward stiffened, glancing sharply at the warden. Arkwright muttered something about damned theatricals, but even he leaned forward now, sensing blood in the water. The warden's face had frozen into an ivory mask. "This is slander," he said quietly. "Idle speculation from a nobleman with too much time on his hands." "Perhaps," said Whimsy easily. "But you see, it is not speculation alone. For Dr. Fenton, poor fellow, stumbled on this very page days before his death. He recognized the note for what it was, a key to an old scandal, one that threatened to re-emerge. He was, I think, on the brink of announcing that the forgery of 1865 was not Carstone's alone. That another hand guided it, a hand that rose to power thereafter, a revelation that would ruin reputations even now." The warden's hand twitched, a tiny involuntary gesture. "But enough." Whimsy pressed the advantage. "Our murderer is not some jealous young scholar, nor a weak-kneed secretary. It is a man who has lived under the shadow of that old sin for half a century, who could not bear the thought of it dragged into daylight. So he silenced Fenton and sought to repeat the pattern, to frame Millward as once Carstone had been framed. A neat symmetry, but too neat. For a moment the library seemed utterly still, as though the stones themselves held their breath. Then, to Whimsy's surprise, it was not the warden but Porter who broke. The secretary let out a strangled sob and covered his face with his hands. "I begged him not to," he cried. "I told him it would be the end of us all. But he said it must be done. That the honor of the college had to be preserved." The warden's voice cut in, sharp as a whip. "Be silent, Porter." His eyes burned with a sudden, terrible intensity. "You fool, do you know what you've said?" But it was too late. The crack had widened. Porter's trembling words had confirmed what Whimsy already knew. That the warden had acted, and that the secretary, through fear or loyalty, had abetted him. The mask had slipped just enough. Whimsy smiled faintly, almost sadly. You see, Inspector, deception is like a manuscript. However carefully copied, however artfully adorned, there is always a slip of the pen, a gloss out of place. Our warden has written too much, and left the margin to betray him. Arkwright, half reluctant, stepped forward, laying a heavy hand on the warden's arm. The old man did not resist, but his gaze lingered on the codex, as though it alone could still justify his crime. Whimsy, watching, felt a chill run through him. For in that gaze he saw not merely guilt, but something more dangerous. A conviction that murder, like forgery, could be excused in the name of scholarship, of honor, of tradition, and that, he thought grimly, was the darkest deception of all. Yet even as the warden was led away, Whimsy's mind would not rest. For Porter's broken cry, his terrified loyalty, hinted at another layer still concealed. The warden might be cornered, but the play was not yet done. There were margins yet unread, and in them, perhaps the final truth. The warden's removal left the air thick with unease, as though the college walls themselves disapproved of what had just transpired. Whimsy, however, could not indulge in any sense of victory. He had seen the warden's eyes, cold, resolute, unrepentant. A man like that would not go down alone, he would pull threads as he fell, hoping one might unravel enough to obscure his guilt. It was a sobering thought, and one that lingered with him into the following morning, when he went to consult the codex again, only to find the lectern empty. For a brief moment he stood staring, as if his mind refused to accept what his eyes told him. Then, sharply, he turned to Porter, who hovered anxiously in the doorway, his pale face marked by the strain of the previous day. "The manuscript, where is it?" Whimsy's tone was clipped, without the lightness he usually affected. Porter stammered. "Inspector Arkwright, he insisted it be taken for secure storage. Said there was danger of tampering." "Indeed," said Whimsy softly, though his eyes had darkened. "And who had charge of the removal?" "The porter's lodge," Porter said quickly. "2 constables, sir. They signed for it." "I swear it." But when Whimsy demanded the ledger at the lodge, the entries were vague, the signatures almost illegible, the time not properly noted. Arkwright, confronted later that morning, swore blind that he had given no such order. "Good God, Whimsy, I may think you're half off your head, but even I wouldn't let that book vanish into thin air. It was still in the library when I left." The implication struck them both at once. Someone had staged an official removal, forging signatures with the same deftness that had once marred the codex itself, and now the manuscript, linchpin of the entire affair, was gone. The effect on the investigation was immediate and corrosive. Millward raged, declaring it a conspiracy to ruin him further. Porter, trembling, denied any involvement, but could not meet anyone's eye. Even the fellows of the college whispered, some hinting that Whimsy himself had contrived the disappearance, eager to play the hero by producing it again at some convenient moment. Arkwright grew restless and more hostile, muttering about amateurs meddling and threatening to take the whole matter out of Whimsy's hands. Whimsy bore it with a surface calm, but inwardly he felt the sting. To lose the codex was not merely an inconvenience, it was the deliberate erasure of the single piece of evidence that tied the present crime to the past. Without it, the warden's guilt could be cast into doubt, Porter's confession dismissed as nervous babble, the entire case turned into smoke. Whoever had arranged its disappearance was no bungler. This was a move calculated to buy silence and time. He spent that day prowling the college like a restless hound, testing the ground for scent. The porter's lodge yielded nothing but confusion. The signatures on the ledger, when compared to other samples, belonged to no one known. The constables swore they had never touched the codex. And yet, someone had walked calmly out of the library with the most precious manuscript in Oxford cradled under his arm, and not one man had raised a cry. That evening, when Wimsey returned to his rooms, he found a scrap of paper pushed under the door. The handwriting was neat, precise, and chillingly anonymous. Let it rest. The past is buried for a reason. Pursue this further and more will vanish, books, men, reputations. Choose wisely. He read it twice, then slipped it into his pocket without a word. The threat was clear, but what chilled him more was the implication that the disappearance of the codex was only the beginning. If manuscripts could be stolen, men could be silenced. The warden, though under watch, might still command loyalty enough to orchestrate such manoeuvres. Or perhaps, Wimsey thought uneasily, there was another player yet unseen, someone who had benefited from the old forgery and feared exposure as much as the warden had. The next morning confirmed his fears. News spread that the college archives had suffered a small accident. A lantern left too close to a pile of papers had ignited, and though the fire was quickly contained, several boxes of correspondence from the 1860s had been reduced to ash. Among them, by cruel coincidence, were letters relating to Carstone's disgrace. The archivist wrung his hands, insisting it had been a terrible mischance, but Wimsey knew better. One accident might be chance, two in succession was strategy. He felt the walls of the puzzle closing in. Without the codex, without the letters, the past was vanishing piece by piece, as though a hand were reaching back through time to erase every trace. Worse still, suspicion now clung to everyone. Was Porter truly the trembling loyalist? Or had he slipped away in the night to feed the flames? Did Millward's fiery indignation mask an eagerness to see the evidence vanish, lest some old folly of his own be uncovered? Even Arkwright, gruff and unimaginative though he was, had both access and authority enough to spirit away a book while loudly protesting his innocence. Wimsey sat late in his rooms, turning over the problem with wary persistence. It was not merely a question of who had killed Fenton. It was who feared the truth so desperately that they would burn history itself to prevent it from emerging. Such a one would not stop at theft or fire. The letter's words echoed in his mind: books, men, reputations. There was one hope yet. The codex was gone. The letters destroyed, but memory could not be so easily obliterated. Fenton had confided in someone. He must have. Scholars did not work in total solitude. They needed to test their discoveries against another mind. If Wimsey could find that confidant, he might recover in words what had been stolen in parchment. But even as that fragile plan formed, another unease tugged at him. The theft of the codex had been executed too smoothly, too silently. That required not only determination, but access to keys, knowledge of procedures, and the confidence to walk through the college like a man entitled. Which meant the enemy was not some faceless intruder, but someone inside, someone trusted, moving under the cover of familiarity. Wimsey leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the thought settle like a stone in his mind. Trust, he realized, was now the rarest commodity of all. Every ally might be an enemy. Every confession might be a deception. He would have to tread carefully, for the ground beneath him was not only treacherous, it was actively being erased. And somewhere, in the deepening shadows of Oxford, the real hand behind this affair was tightening its grip, preparing for a final stroke that might yet silence the truth forever. Wimsey had just begun to chart a new approach, sketching the network of suspects and their possible motives in his mind, when the call came. Porter arrived breathless, eyes wide, muttering in a near panic. "Sir, it's Millward. He's dead." The words landed like a physical blow. Wimsey's heart sank, not out of sentimentality for the man, whose temperament had often grated on him, but because the timing was devastating. Millward had been outspoken, defiant, full of righteous fury over the Codex's disappearance. He was the kind of man who would speak, challenge, act, making him a threat to the hidden hand manipulating events from the shadows. And now he was gone. "Explain, Porter," Wimsey said, his voice calm but ice beneath it. Porter's lips trembled. "I found him this morning in his rooms, on the floor, blood, and the window open. Someone must have." He broke off, unable to complete the sentence. Wimsey felt the familiar surge of sharp adrenaline that accompanied a sudden twist in an investigation. He moved swiftly to Millward's rooms, his mind racing even as his eyes scanned for details. The scene was chaotic: drawers overturned, papers scattered, a chair tipped onto the floor. Blood marked the carpet, smeared in what seemed a desperate struggle. Yet nothing was missing, at least nothing obvious. The open window drew Wimsey's attention immediately. A quick glance outside revealed nothing, no footprints in the dew, no sign of a hurried escape. Whoever had entered or left had done so with extraordinary caution. This was no random act of violence, it was targeted, deliberate. As he examined the room more closely, Wimsey noticed a subtle irregularity. A small, leather-bound notebook lay on the floor beneath the desk. Its pages flipped open to a section marked with a ribbon. The handwriting was hurried, scrawled in Millward's precise script, but one passage had been crossed out violently, ink smudged across the paper. The words beneath, though partly obscured, hinted at a discovery he had made, something that would expose the Codex's thief, or perhaps a larger scheme linking the past to the present crimes. Wimsey's mind raced. Millward's death was no isolated incident, it was a warning. A move to silence those who might untangle the threads leading back to the missing manuscript. He thought immediately of Porter, whose anxiety now bordered on hysteria, and of Arkwright, whose irritability had escalated since the Codex vanished. Each seemed innocent enough, yet Wimsey knew appearances were treacherous. By mid-morning, the college was a storm of murmurs and speculation. The fellows locked themselves behind doors, whispering in worried tones. Porter tried to keep order, but the tension was palpable, a living thing vibrating in the hallways. Wimsey, moving quietly among them, made mental notes of each reaction. Some masks of shock were too perfect, others too muted. The subtle tells of those hiding more than fear. Then came the letter, slipped under his door, just as before. But this one carried a more immediate menace. "You meddle too closely. Step aside, or next time it will not be Millward. Your safety is already fragile. Decide where you stand." Wimsey read it twice, noting the shift from warning to threat. The hand behind this knew his habits, his routines, perhaps even his mind. The detective's resolve hardened. Whoever had killed Millward, whoever had taken the Codex, was still several steps ahead. But that did not mean they were invincible. The question now was not merely uncovering the past or retrieving stolen documents. It was preventing the next strike, predicting the next move of an opponent who had proven both cunning and ruthlessness. Wimsey retraced his steps mentally, cataloging every minor clue that might have been overlooked. He returned to Millward's notebook, scrutinizing the crossed-out lines, even partially obscured. Certain words leapt from the page: warden, letters, confession, and a mention of a third party, unnamed, whose intervention Millward feared would be fatal. There it was. The first explicit hint that the warden, though suspect, was not acting alone. The implications were chilling. The missing codex, the destroyed correspondence, the anonymous threats, all pointed to a coordinated effort. Whimsy realized the case had grown exponentially more complex. This was no longer a historical theft or a personal vengeance. It was a network of secrets and lies, a predator weaving a pattern of fear through the lives of all who sought the truth. The breakthrough came almost imperceptibly. A minor discrepancy in the list of Millwood's recent visitors, which had seemed inconsequential, suddenly assumed gravity. One name kept reappearing. A young scholar, recently arrived, whose enthusiasm had masked something far darker. Whimsy recalled their last conversation. Polite, eager, offering trivial details about the library's cataloging system. Now, in light of Millwood's death, those details took on a sinister weight. He resolved to confront the scholar immediately, but before he could move, a commotion erupted in the hall. Porter's frantic voice carried down the corridor. Someone had been seen leaving the warden's quarters at an odd hour, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. The college erupted into controlled chaos as fellows tried to intervene. Whimsy's mind worked at lightning speed. If the warden or an accomplice had retrieved something, documents, letters, perhaps another piece of evidence, it could mean another fatal misstep. Moving quickly, Whimsy followed, keeping to the shadows, watching as the figure disappeared around the corner and into a narrow, seldom used staircase. He recognized the route immediately. It led to the old archives, a labyrinthine part of the college where even the fellows rarely ventured. The scholar was heading straight into the heart of the hidden past, possibly to remove or destroy more evidence. Whimsy accelerated, silent but relentless. The game had changed. What had begun as a murder and a theft had now escalated into a perilous pursuit, with lives and history itself hanging in the balance. Whoever orchestrated this was confident, meticulous and cruel, yet they had underestimated one thing: Whimsy's intuition, honed to a razor's edge, could track not only what was visible but what had been hidden in plain sight. By the time he reached the staircase, the scholar had vanished. A small scrap of cloth fluttered from the shadowed railing, a fragment of the bundle, torn perhaps in haste. Whimsy picked it up carefully, noting its unusual texture and a faint, acrid smell, like the remnants of a chemical solution. His eyes narrowed. Whoever had handled this was preparing, deliberately, to erase any trace of their interference. The stakes had never been higher. The investigation was no longer merely about uncovering a single murderer or recovering a stolen codex. It was about anticipating the next move of a criminal mind several steps ahead, about protecting potential victims from becoming pawns in a hidden game. Whimsy understood, with the clarity that always came in moments of peril, that the second murder was only the beginning, and that if he miscalculated, the next strike might very well land closer to him than anyone expected. He pocketed the scrap of cloth, his thoughts already racing through possibilities and contingencies. Somewhere in the shadows of the college, the perpetrator watched, calculated, and waited. Whimsy's task was now not merely to solve a crime, but to survive the unfolding trap, to navigate the unseen currents of a conspiracy stretching from the distant past into the present, and to prevent history from claiming another victim. The hunt had intensified, and the detective knew that every moment lost could mean the difference between revelation and catastrophe. Whimsy stood in the half-light of the archive staircase, the fragment of cloth pinched between his fingers, its acrid tang lingering faintly in the air. For all the confusion, for all the deliberate misdirection, he felt the first stirrings of clarity. Millwood's murder, the vanished codex, The stolen correspondence, the veiled threats, it had all been orchestrated with remarkable precision. Yet precision, however artful, often left a trace, a rhythm, a pattern. He could almost sense it, like the outline of a melody faintly audible beneath dissonant noise. He returned to Millward's rooms once more, notebook in hand, and laid the scattered pieces of evidence before him. The letters burned in the grate, the notebook with its violently crossed-out lines, the anonymous warnings, all fragments of a larger design. And then his mind caught on a memory, not a clue in the strict sense, but a remark. A casual comment made by Porter only days before, when discussing the vanished codex. It is not the first time our shelves have suffered such depredations. Lord Whimsy. The college has had its eccentric guardians. At the time, Whimsy had dismissed it as the ordinary lament of a scholar protective of his institution's treasures. But now it chimed differently in his thoughts. Eccentric guardians. Was this not what Millward had been? Violent in manner, obstinate, but fiercely protective of the codex. And yet Millward had hinted, in his notes, at another. The warden's name stood prominently, tied not to the theft itself, but to some confession, some old guilt. Some shadow stretching backward through time. Whimsy's thoughts shifted to the archives. The scholar fleeing there with his mysterious bundle. The archives were more than a storeroom, they were the living memory of the college, a labyrinth of forgotten histories and disputes. If someone wished to alter the truth, to manipulate the present by reshaping the past, the archives would be their battlefield. And in that context, the acrid, smelling scrap of cloth acquired a terrible clarity, chemicals, not to preserve, but to erase. He drew Millward's notebook closer. The crossed-out lines, the smudge of ink, the hurried hand. All the signs of a man desperate to commit to paper what he dared not speak aloud. He had feared not exposure for himself, but for another. Warden, letters, confession. And then, the fatal warning intervention fatal. Whimsy had seen it before in cases where guilt was an inheritance, passed down like an heirloom from one generation to the next. What if the theft of the codex, the silencing of Millward, was not an isolated conspiracy, but the echo of an older scandal, something long buried in the college's past, resurfacing now like a revenant demanding recognition? The question gnawed at him as he walked the cloisters that evening, keeping his presence discreet among the fellows whose nerves frayed visibly with each passing hour. They whispered in corners, avoided one another's eyes, and locked their doors with a fervor unbecoming of men of learning. Their habits, their movements, their patterns. Whimsy observed them all, and it was in these observations that something trivial, something absurdly small, began to shine. Arkwright, irritable and sharp-tongued, had always carried with him a battered fountain pen. He used it not only for notes but as a nervous tick, clicking the cap, turning it in his fingers. Yet today, when they had gathered briefly in the dining hall, Whimsy noted with a flicker of surprise that Arkwright had produced another pen entirely. Sleek, polished, distinctly newer. The old one, the one he had fiddled with endlessly, was gone. It was not the absence of the pen itself that intrigued Whimsy, but its timing. Arkwright had been with Millward on the day before his death, arguing vehemently about the codex, his voice echoing down the passageways. Could it be that the old pen, in some way, connected him to that fatal scene? Perhaps left behind in Millward's rooms, perhaps stained with something its owner could not explain. And so, the simplest solution: replace it, discard the incriminating object, present the world with an innocuous substitute. The idea was speculative, but in Whimsy's experience, such substitutions were never accidental. They betrayed not only guilt but the attempt to disguise it, And it was not only Arkwright who revealed himself through habit. Porter, too, had patterns of behavior, always locking doors twice, always arranging his books with obsessive precision. Yet when Whimsy had entered the library after the first theft, one shelf had been peculiarly disordered, volumes shoved in haphazardly. Porter had passed it off as Millwood's clumsiness. But Whimsy now saw the lie for what it was. The disarray had masked an intrusion, a hurried removal, a concealed exchange. The threads began to draw together. The anonymous letters always slipped under Whimsy's door at hours when few stirred. The smell of chemicals clinging faintly not only to the cloth scrap but, he remembered suddenly, to the sleeve of the young scholar he had passed days ago, his enthusiasm betraying a restlessness that seemed out of place in a man ostensibly devoted to cataloguing. And Millwood's notebook, with its veiled references to confessions, guardianship, and fatal interventions. A pattern was indeed emerging, a conspiracy layered not only in action, but in personality, in the peculiarities of men too bound to their own habits to conceal them fully. Someone sought to erase the past, while simultaneously silencing the present. Someone who believed that truth could be dissolved as surely as ink in acid. Whimsy knew then that the codex itself was not merely a relic. It was evidence, tangible proof of some ancient sin, plagiarism, fraud, betrayal, that, if exposed, would ruin reputations carefully built over generations. The theft had never been about money, it was about suppression. And Millwood, rash in speech but clear in loyalty, had been murdered because he came too near to dragging that truth into the light. He leaned against the cool stone of the cloister, closing his eyes for a moment, allowing the pattern to settle into place. The warden, the fellows, the nervous young scholar, all players in a drama rehearsed long ago. But who was orchestrating the current act? The answer lay not in the grand gestures, but in the smallest missteps: a pen exchanged, a shelf disordered, a casual remark spoken carelessly. The danger was sharper now than ever. The killer had struck twice, and with each strike their confidence grew. But with each strike also came an error, a trace, an unguarded detail. And Whimsy, attuned to such minutiae, felt certainty steal upon him. The codex, the chemicals, the confessions, all of it pointed towards a mind meticulous yet human, ruthless yet bound by pattern. He straightened, pocketing the scrap of cloth. The game was entering its final stage. The villain, hidden in plain sight, had already betrayed more than they realized. And if Whimsy played his part carefully, guiding the shadows into light, the pattern that had taken shape would soon reveal not only the hand, but the face of the one who had woven it. The key to the case had been there all along, waiting for someone to see. Would you like me to carry this momentum directly into the next outline part, where Whimsy begins setting a deliberate trap using this newly realized pattern? Whimsy paced the dimly lit study. The leather-bound codex resting on the desk before him, its pages carefully splayed to prevent further damage. Every clue, every errant behavior he had noted, every subtle misstep now converged into a single, coherent image. But the motive behind it all remained elusive, like a shadow at the edge of perception. He knew the villain had not acted out of simple greed or rivalry. Those explanations were too mundane for the intricacy of the crimes committed. There was a deeper force at work, a compulsive drive, and until he understood it, the threat could not be neutralized. He revisited the sequence of events in his mind. Millwood had been silenced, the codex stolen, correspondence tampered with, and evidence erased with painstaking care. The second crime had jolted the entire college into fear, and yet in every act, the hand of the perpetrator had left faint traces, patterns in behavior, tiny errors in execution, that now, like pieces of a puzzle, began to form a recognizable design. Whimsy could sense the mind behind it, obsessive, meticulous, but fixated on something far beyond mere scholarship or reputation. It was Arkwright who had given him the final clue, though he had not realized it at the time. The subtle change in habit, the replacement of his pen, the nervous adjustment of cufflinks, the hesitation when answering even the most mundane questions, these were not signs of guilt alone, but indicators of a mind wrestling with a singular obsession. And it was this obsession that finally illuminated the hidden motive. Whimsy considered the codex itself not valuable merely for its antiquity, nor for the secrets it might hold about the college's past, but for something far more personal. Millward had been its reluctant guardian, aware of its contents and the repercussions they could unleash. The villain, however, had approached the codex with a psychological fixation, the need to control history itself, to erase perceived slights, to manipulate knowledge as a weapon. Every act, the theft, the murders, the cover-ups, was a step toward this ultimate goal. He realized then that the villain's psychology was rooted in fear, but not the fear of exposure or punishment. It was a fear of irrelevance, of having the past judged without their influence, of leaving a narrative incomplete or tainted. By silencing Millward, by altering evidence, by obscuring connections, the perpetrator sought not only to protect themselves, but to assert dominance over memory, over truth. It was not ambition, but obsession, an unyielding compulsion to shape reality to match an internal vision of justice and order. The pattern became clear in the small details. The carefully orchestrated interactions, the timing of the letters, the deliberate placement and removal of objects, the selection of victims. Each act had been designed not only to conceal, but to communicate, to impose a structure upon chaos. Whimsy understood now that the villain's crimes were acts of psychological theater, a performance meant to control perception as much as to achieve a tangible end. Porter's anxious glances, the warden's carefully worded statements, even the missteps of younger scholars, all these were instruments in a larger scheme. And within that scheme lay the motive, the need to assert intellectual supremacy, to craft a legacy untouched by error, and to eliminate anyone who might disrupt the meticulous vision the villain had constructed. The codex was both symbol and tool, its contents irrelevant outside the context of control and power. Whimsy's mind turned over one crucial element that had gone largely unnoticed: the chemical residue on the scrap of cloth. Not merely a preservative or an eraser of evidence, but a deliberate signature, a subtle assertion of mastery over material and circumstance. The villain had left a mark that only someone attuned to nuance could detect, a hidden call to recognition that revealed both genius and derangement. It was at this point that the detective pieced together the final link. Each act of concealment, each misdirection, each accident, had been informed by a profound fear of imperfection, a relentless drive to assert dominance over both history and present reality. And the reason the villain had been so careful, so calculating, so extraordinarily patient, was that their psyche demanded it. They were not merely solving a problem, they were performing an internal ritual, imposing their mental order on the external world. With this understanding, Whimsy could now anticipate the next move. The villain would not act impulsively, they would follow the pattern, guided by obsession, seeking the final act of mastery. Every interaction would be manipulated, every opportunity exploited, until the codex was secured and the narrative entirely controlled. The detective realized that stopping them would require more than vigilance. It required the use of that same psychological insight to predict, to outthink, to draw the villain into revealing their own compulsions. The subtle cracks in behavior that Whimsy had observed, the hesitations, the micro-adjustments, the seemingly irrelevant corrections, suddenly formed a coherent strategy. The villain was compelled to repeat patterns, to correct perceived mistakes, to assert control at every juncture. This compulsive repetition was not weakness, but predictability, and predictability was the tool Whimsy would employ. As night deepened over the college, Whimsy drafted a plan that relied not on confrontation, but on anticipation. He would use the villain's own need for control against them, setting the stage so that each step, each reaction, revealed a little more of the hidden motive. The understanding of obsession, of psychological compulsion, was his advantage. By exploiting the pattern, he could bring the villain to a point where their actions betrayed not only method, but intent, exposing the ultimate motive for all to see. The revelation itself chilled him. The crime was not born of passion or greed, but of a meticulous, obsessive need to dominate reality and history. The villain had killed, stolen, and manipulated not because they wanted wealth, revenge, or even recognition, but because their mind demanded it, a compulsion that made them both brilliant and dangerously unhinged. And yet, it was precisely this compulsion that would lead them to their undoing. Whimsy leaned back, feeling the weight of the revelation settle. Knowledge of the hidden motive changed everything. It transformed a tangled web of misdirection into a predictable sequence of actions. The villain was still steps ahead, but now Whimsy could see the path they were bound to follow. And in seeing it, he could plan not only to catch them but to prevent further harm. Every glance, every gesture, every choice the villain would make in the coming hours could be read, anticipated, turned to advantage. The hidden motive was no longer hidden. It was a compass pointing straight to the heart of the crime. And Whimsy, armed with insight and patience, now moved toward the final confrontation, knowing that the villain's own mind would betray them, revealing the lengths they had gone to satisfy a need far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. The detective's resolve hardened, the motive understood, the pattern clear, the villain's psychology exposed. He was ready. The stage was set, and the final act would demand cunning, courage, and precision. For in the obsession that drove the crimes, Whimsy now saw both vulnerability and inevitability. The key to ending the terror lay in making the villain act exactly as their own mind compelled them to do. The night had settled over the college with an oppressive stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant clatter of a carriage on cobblestone. Whimsy moved quietly through the corridors, each step measured, each sense alert. He had spent the better part of the day preparing, arranging every detail with a meticulousness that mirrored the villain's own compulsions. This was not a hasty trap born of impulse, but a carefully orchestrated stage on which the final act would unfold. Every shadow, every sound, every potential witness had been accounted for. He paused outside the study where the codex had been kept, the room now empty save for the faint scent of ink and old leather. The placement of the furniture, the alignment of chairs, even the positioning of a single pen on the desk. Each element was deliberately arranged to provoke a reaction, to lure the villain into revealing the depths of their obsession. Whimsy knew that the criminal would respond to perceived imperfection, to the suggestion that the codex had been mishandled or exposed, and it was precisely this compulsion he intended to exploit. Footsteps echoed softly behind him, and he turned to see the warden, his expression tight with anxiety. "Everything in place, sir?" he asked. Whimsy gave a slight nod, his eyes scanning the corridor one last time. "Patience," he said. "Let us see how a mind driven by obsession reacts when it believes the order it controls is threatened. Minutes passed, each stretching tautly, until the faint creak of a floorboard signaled the arrival of the villain. They entered cautiously, glancing about with a meticulous eye that missed nothing. Every adjustment they made, the straightening of a chair, the repositioning of a book, the subtle rearrangement of the codex itself, confirmed Whimsy's understanding. This was the person who could not tolerate imperfection, who had murdered and manipulated not out of simple malice, but because the world, as it existed, was never aligned with the vision their mind demanded. Whimsy stepped into the room, calm and deliberate. "I trust the codex has been treated with the utmost care?" he asked, his tone neutral, almost conversational. The villain froze, a flicker of tension passing across their features, before it was masked by a practiced composure. "Of course," they said, though the subtle tremor of the hand that adjusted the codex betrayed more than words could. "That's good," Whimsy continued, moving slowly, circling the room so that every adjustment made by the villain could be observed, catalogued, and anticipated. "It would be most unfortunate if even a single page were damaged, would it not?" The villain's eyes darted nervously to the edges of the codex, fingers hovering as if compelled to check, correct, ensure perfection. It was the opening Whimsy had been waiting for, the small, irresistible compulsion that would expose intent. The detective's gaze softened, almost pitying, though no mercy would be shown for what had been done. "You see," he said, "it is precisely this need for control, this obsession with order, that has led us here. Each misstep, each act of concealment, has been an attempt to impose your vision upon reality. But the pattern is complete now, and the truth is unavoidable." The villain's composure cracked. Just enough for a flicker of fear to appear, quickly masked but unmistakable to the trained eye. You think you understand me," they said, voice low, a mix of defiance and unease. Whimsy inclined his head. "I do. I understand the motive, the obsession, the compulsion that drove every act. And knowing this," he gestured lightly to the codex and the carefully orchestrated room, "I also know your next move. For a heartbeat." The villain considered escape, the urge to flee palpable in the slight shift of weight, the restless adjustment of clothing, the imperceptible glance toward the door. But the trap was complete. Every exit had been accounted for, every potential ally positioned to intervene, every object arranged to prevent any hurried concealment. Whimsy's anticipation of their psychological patterns left them with only one choice: confrontation. "You cannot run," Whimsy continued, his voice firm yet controlled. "Your mind demands perfection, demands control. And control cannot be achieved in flight. The only way to satisfy your compulsion now is to act according to the pattern, and the pattern leads here, to this moment." A tense silence filled the room, broken only by the villain's measured breathing. Their eyes flicked across the codex, the desk, the slight imperfections deliberately left by Whimsy to provoke reaction, each one a silent nudge toward confession. Finally, a slow exhale escaped the villain. You know why," they said, voice wavering. "You know it's never been about wealth or fame or even revenge. It's about control. About shaping everything into a form that makes sense. And you've seen it all." "Yes," Whimsy replied, stepping closer, voice unwavering. "And now, with all the pieces in place, there is nowhere left for deception to hide. Every action, every misstep, every crime, explained, anticipated, understood." He paused, allowing the weight of the realization to settle. "But it does not need to end in chaos. You may surrender, and the pattern can be completed without further bloodshed." The villain's eyes flickered between defiance and resignation, mind racing for alternatives, for one last chance to assert the control that had driven them for so long. They reached toward the desk, then froze, realizing the gesture had been anticipated and would only confirm guilt. Whimsy's calm, unwavering presence left no room for improvisation, no corner for escape. At last a faint nod, barely perceptible, acknowledged the inevitability. I cannot undo what I've done," the villain admitted, voice low, the compulsion that had driven them now laid bare. "But I can ensure it ends according to my design." The confession hung in the air, both a release and an indictment, a culmination of obsession manifesting fully under the scrutiny of understanding. Whimsy inclined his head, noting the psychological precision of the final act. "Then the pattern is complete," he said, almost gently. "You have revealed the motive, the compulsion, the full scope of your actions. Now, justice may follow in turn." Outside, footsteps and hushed voices signaled the arrival of those positioned to intervene once the confession was secured. The villain, though still tense, made no attempt to flee. The inevitability of the trap, the recognition of their own patterns, had rendered resistance futile. Whimsy's careful orchestration, his anticipation of obsession and compulsion, had turned the villain's greatest strength into the instrument of their own capture. As the authorities moved in, the detective allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The case, complex and harrowing, had been resolved not through brute force or sudden revelation, but through insight, patience, and a deep understanding of human psychology. The hidden motive had been uncovered, the pattern exposed, and the villain compelled to reveal themselves entirely. And yet, even in the aftermath, Whimsy knew the echoes of obsession would linger, the lessons of control and compulsion etched into memory like the faint trace of an indelible ink. The final confrontation had ended, but the implications, the understanding of human nature so starkly revealed, would resonate far beyond the walls of the college. The villain, now secured and restrained, offered a final, inscrutable glance at Whimsy, a mixture of respect, resentment, and reluctant acknowledgement of defeat. The detective met the gaze evenly, recognizing in it the reflection of the same obsession that had driven the entire sequence of crimes. In this final confrontation, it had become clear that while the pattern could be completed and justice served, the mind that created it would forever remain a study in the perilous potency of compulsion, obsession, and the unyielding human desire for control. As the room emptied of the last traces of tension, Whimsy allowed a rare, faint smile. The trap had worked, the case resolved, and the hidden forces behind the crimes had been laid bare. The final confrontation had not been violent, nor dramatic in the theatrical sense. Yet it had achieved a far greater victory: the unveiling of truth, the exposure of motive, and the restoration of order, fragile though it might remain, within a world that had teetered perilously close to chaos. Whimsy turned to leave, each step measured and deliberate, already anticipating the meticulous reconstruction of events that would follow. The villain's psychology, the compulsion that had guided every act, had been both the tool and the undoing, and in understanding it, he had not only solved the crimes, but mastered the invisible architecture of obsession itself. Just as Whimsy allowed himself a moment's reprieve, the soft chime of the grandfather clock in the corridor echoed through the study, a stark reminder that time never paused, even in the aftermath of confession. The authorities had escorted the villain away, their footsteps fading into the stone hallways, leaving the detective alone with the codex, the residue of tension still thick in the air. For a moment, he breathed deeply, convinced the worst had passed. confident that the pattern had been exposed and the motive laid bare. Yet instinct, honed over decades of observing human behavior, whispered that resolution rarely arrived without one final sting. It was a subtle detail, barely perceptible at first. The codex, once meticulously arranged, now bore a faint smudge on its edge, as though someone had handled it hurriedly, yet carefully enough to avoid obvious disturbance. Whimsy crouched, inspecting the mark under the dim light. The smudge was not random, it was deliberate. The faint residue of a finger that had lingered too long in a precise spot, a signature of someone who had been watching, waiting, and had never been as far from the scene as they pretended. He retraced his steps mentally, recalling each moment of the confrontation. The villain's confession had been complete, yet there had been something they hadn't said. An almost imperceptible hesitation, a twitch in the eye, a slight falter in tone when referring to certain passages of the codex. At the time, he had chalked it up to the strain of exposure, but now, with the codex's smudge as tangible evidence, doubt seeped in. There was a second hand, someone operating behind the scenes. Someone who had manipulated events from the shadows, allowing the first villain to act as a decoy while they pursued their true objective. Whimsy's mind raced, connecting the faintest threads. Earlier, he had noticed minor discrepancies in the schedule of the library staff, small adjustments to deliveries that seemed inconsequential at first. Now, viewed through the lens of this new evidence, they were not oversights but deliberate diversions, intended to mislead him and obscure the real architect of the chaos. The realization settled with a weight that was both familiar and chilling. The game was not over, and the final checkmate was still being plotted. He returned to the main corridor, moving silently, retracing the villain's supposed path to verify whether any additional manipulation had occurred. Each door, each passage, each angle of light revealed subtle hints. A book slightly out of place, a chair angled as if recently shifted, a discarded scrap of paper with cryptic annotations. Every small anomaly was now a clue pointing toward an unseen hand. The investigation, once thought complete, reopened with the sudden intensity of a storm breaking over calm waters. A muffled sound drew his attention to the library's upper gallery. Whimsy ascended the narrow stairs with deliberate quiet, eyes scanning the shadows for the faintest movement. A figure, half hidden behind the tall shelves, froze when they noticed him. The stranger's posture was rigid, but not defensive. It was calculated, as though anticipating Whimsy's arrival all along. The detective's gaze sharpened. This was no ordinary witness or opportunistic interloper. The figure carried themselves with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with the codex and its significance. Someone who had orchestrated events with a patience and precision that rivaled even his own. "Quite a show you staged," Whimsy said softly, breaking the silence without advancing too quickly. "But the finale, it seems I am still missing a few key notes." The figure shifted, the dim lamplight catching their eyes. Intelligent, measured, and unflinchingly observant. "You are perceptive," the stranger said, voice calm but edged with amusement. "Too perceptive, perhaps. That is why the first player had to fall, to test your ability. To ensure you would follow the threads to me." There was a pause, pregnant with implication. The pattern you believed complete was merely a prelude. Whimsy's mind moved at lightning speed, analyzing every detail. The timing of events, the placement of the codex, the subtle diversions, the villain's prior obsession with order. It was now clear the earlier acts, the murders, the confessions, had all been orchestrated to provoke, to manipulate, and to reveal how far the detective would go, how closely he could observe, and how thoroughly he could predict human behavior. The true mastermind had been testing him, shaping the investigation like a chessboard, moving pawns and minor pieces, ensuring that only when he was confident in Whimsy's abilities would the final confrontation occur. "You've been behind it all," Whimsy said, his voice steady despite the sudden surge of tension. "The killings, the codex manipulations, the false confession, every step designed to distract, to mislead, to measure my responses." A faint smile flickered on the stranger's lips. "Exactly. And now the final move awaits. You must see the full picture, or all your efforts, your clever deductions, your careful traps, will serve only to complete my design." They stepped forward slightly, revealing a hand holding a folded piece of paper, one that had been absent from all previous discoveries. Whimsy's eyes caught the edge, a faint glint that indicated a cipher, a hidden set of instructions, or a revelation not yet uncovered. The detective's pulse quickened, not from fear but from exhilaration. The case, once thought solved, now demanded every ounce of his intellect, every subtle observation, and every capacity for anticipating human behavior. He took a measured step closer, keeping his tone calm, almost conversational, to maintain psychological equilibrium. "And what is this final design? What is the endgame you believe will outwit me?" The stranger's gaze held his for a long moment, and then, deliberately, they began to unfold the paper. Each crease revealed meticulously arranged symbols, numbers, and notes. Cryptic yet undeniably deliberate. A code designed for someone capable of discerning the layers of intent beneath superficial chaos. Whimsy's eyes scanned rapidly, recognizing the methodology, the sequence, the pattern embedded within a pattern. It was brilliant, audacious, and deeply personal, a puzzle that mirrored the criminal mind in its entirety. The codex was never the prize, the mastermind said, voice quiet but insistent. It was a lure. The true objective is to see how the detective reacts when confronted not just with a crime, but with the orchestration of human nature itself. And now, you must decide, will you succumb to the apparent simplicity of the solution, or will you see through to the end? Whimsy's mind raced, synthesizing the evidence, the confessions, the manipulations, the smudges, and the overlooked anomalies. Each detail, no matter how trivial it seemed, now fit into a larger mosaic. He realized the confrontation was not merely about stopping a crime. It was about anticipating intellect, predicting the choices of a mind as cunning as his own. The final move, the last-minute twist, was not an act of violence or deceit alone. It was a challenge, a test of reasoning and psychological acuity. With a measured breath, he spoke, his tone even yet carrying the weight of absolute understanding. "You sought to manipulate me, to measure my insight, to orchestrate events from behind the curtain. But the truth," he gestured lightly to the unfolded paper, "cannot be hidden forever. Every compulsion, every misstep, every concealment has left a trail, and I intend to follow it to its ultimate conclusion." The mastermind's expression shifted slightly, a mixture of surprise and admiration. "Very well," they said softly. "Then let the true game begin." In that moment, the room seemed charged with the collision of two extraordinary minds. The case, once thought resolved, had erupted anew into a battle of intellect and anticipation. Whimsy knew that this final revelation would demand all his skill, that the last-minute twist was not an ending, but a doorway into the deepest recesses of human cunning. And as he prepared to confront the hidden architect, he understood that the resolution of this puzzle would require not only observation, deduction, and patience, but the full comprehension of the human psyche in its most intricate, dangerous, and brilliant form. The shadows deepened, the clock ticked on, And the detective stepped forward, ready to face the final challenge that had been lying in wait all along. Whimsy's eyes never wavered from the figure across the gallery, the tension in the room crackling like static before a storm. The unfolded paper in the mastermind's hands had been a final taunt, a challenge to his reasoning, and yet every line, every ciphered notation, only reinforced the path he had already begun to see. The codex, the false confessions, the diversions, all pieces of an elaborate choreography meant to obscure a truth that had, in reality, been in plain sight from the very start. "You underestimated the obvious," Whimsy said, his tone calm but carrying the weight of revelation. "While you meticulously planned every distraction, every false lead, the real trail was laid bare in the smallest of details. The gestures, the placement of objects, the subtle changes in the environment. Each act of yours left an imprint, and those imprints form a map that even your careful misdirections could not erase." The mastermind's lips twitched in an almost imperceptible smirk. "So? You believe you can untangle the web I've woven? Even now, after all the chaos?" "I don't just believe," Whimsy replied, stepping closer. "I know. Consider the codex. You made sure it was in plain view, yet you never anticipated that anyone would notice the smudge on its edge. That smudge was not accidental. It was a signature left unconsciously, revealing the hand that moved behind the scenes. The first villain you manipulated was simply a pawn, a decoy to gauge my attentiveness. Every slip they made, every hesitation, they were there to test me, to see if I could distinguish the real player from the false." The mastermind's expression shifted, a fleeting shadow of surprise crossing a face carefully cultivated for control. "And yet," they murmured, "here we are." "Yes," Whimsy said, his gaze unflinching. "Here we are. But it is not enough to confuse me." The trail continued, delivery logs subtly altered. Library staff following schedules that were almost but not quite correct, minor deviations in the codex's arrangement. Each one, seemingly insignificant, was in fact a breadcrumb leading me directly to you. Even your final challenge, this paper with its cryptic symbols, is a culmination of your ego, designed to provoke me into overthinking. But you failed to account for one thing. The mind that observes with patient care notices what is never intended to be noticed. The figure stiffened, realizing that the calm voice dissecting their maneuvers did not belong to someone easily outwitted. A pause stretched between them, heavy and measured, as if the room itself was awaiting the culmination of a duel fought not with weapons but with intellect. Then, with a sudden, almost theatrical motion, the mastermind's hands shot out toward a nearby window. Whimsy's reflexes, honed through countless confrontations, were instantaneous. But the figure was fast, too fast. In a blur, they vaulted over the low sill, a shadow flitting into the night, leaving behind only the faint rustle of their coat. Whimsy surged forward, catching the edge of the window sill, but the distance was already lost. The city streets beyond swallowed the fleeing figure, and the detective's heart thudded. Not in defeat, but in measured acknowledgement of the challenge still lingering. Yet the resolution was not entirely elusive. Even as the mastermind disappeared into the labyrinthine alleys, Whimsy remained, absorbing every clue they had left behind. The codex smudge, the subtly altered library records, the folded cipher, each was a trail of breadcrumbs for those willing to follow. He bent over the unfolded paper once more. Now seeing the final layer, the instructions were a confession in themselves, the confession of intent, the blueprint of manipulation that exposed the true genius and danger of the hidden hand. Justice, Whimsy murmured, almost to himself, does not always require immediate capture. Sometimes it lies in comprehension, in revealing the full scope of the crime, in showing that nothing, no matter how intricate, escapes observation. He straightened, the weight of the case settling into a quiet satisfaction. Even if the villain had slipped through the night, their actions were now fully mapped, their psychology unveiled, their patterns deciphered. Returning to the study, Whimsy reconstructed the sequence of events for the authorities, who had remained in anxious anticipation outside the gallery. With meticulous detail, he laid out the clues, the false villain's missteps, the carefully placed smudge, the minor inconsistencies in scheduling, the deliberate positioning of objects to manipulate attention, and the ultimate revelation hidden in the cryptic paper. Each element, he explained, had been designed to test, to distract, to mislead. But none could withstand the patient analysis that traced the unseen mastermind's strategy. The first act was a decoy, Whimsy said, indicating the earlier confession, a staged series of crimes meant to measure my perception. The true orchestrator remained behind the curtain, manipulating events with a precision that demanded acute attention to detail. The second villain was merely a tool, removed once their usefulness was complete. And the final confrontation, here in this very gallery, was the true stage, where every action was calculated to provoke, to test, and to reveal the depth of the mind I now face. He paused, letting the gravity of the explanation settle. The criminal may have escaped physically, but intellectually, they are fully accounted for. Every choice, every deception, every maneuver has been exposed. That is the form of justice that endures understanding, anticipation, and the certainty that no manipulation, no matter how clever, can remain hidden forever. Outside, the city remained oblivious to the duel of minds that had just unfolded within its quiet streets. The mastermind, though free for now, carried with them the knowledge that their genius had been unraveled, their tactics catalogued, and their intent fully comprehended. Whimsy's methodical patience had transformed potential chaos into clarity, proving once again that even the most intricate schemes leave traces, and that an observant mind can follow them, piece by piece, to their ultimate revelation. He returned to the codex one last time, examining the subtle annotations the fleeing figure had left behind. Each mark, each smudge, each deviation, was a signature of a mind as brilliant as it was dangerous. Whimsy smiled faintly, not in triumph over the villain, but in quiet acknowledgement of the challenge itself. The pursuit would continue. Perhaps another night, perhaps another case. But the certainty remained. No detail too small, no deception too clever, could escape the vigilance of a mind trained to observe, to reason, and to see beyond the apparent. As the clock struck midnight, the detective finally allowed himself to relax, yet only slightly. The streets outside were dark and unyielding, a maze into which the mastermind had disappeared. And while the immediate danger had passed, the shadow of unfinished business lingered. A reminder that in the world of intellect and crime, where the line between justice served and justice delayed is often as slender and precise as the edge of a smudged codex page. Whimsy closed the book gently, tucking the cryptic paper into his coat. The city was silent, the night deep, and the case, though temporarily concluded, left a lingering thrill. That ultimate satisfaction of understanding the human mind, anticipating the unexpected, and remaining, as always, one step ahead. The villain might have escaped, but their pattern, their intent, and their very essence had been fully revealed. And in that revelation, justice, in its quietest yet most enduring form, had already been served. Whimsy stepped out into the chill of the early morning, the fog curling around the lampposts like wisps of some ethereal truth, half seen and half remembered. The city streets, empty now, seemed to stretch endlessly before him, each corner, an alleyway, a potential hiding place for secrets yet undiscovered. Though the immediate case had reached its climax, the night's revelations still hummed quietly in his mind, each fragment of evidence resonating with a faint, unanswered echo. Even as he walked, reconstructing every step from the gallery to the streets beyond, a subtle detail refused to settle. The mastermind's smudge on the codex, the peculiar crease in the cryptic paper, the way one of the decoys had paused for just a fraction too long when handing over a seemingly inconsequential envelope. Something about it nagged at him. A soft insistence that there was more hidden beneath the surface. Most detectives would have considered the matter closed, the villain gone but catalogued, their plans unmasked. Whimsy, however, felt the familiar itch of curiosity that would not be soothed by closure alone. He paused near a wrought iron fence, his hand brushing against the cold metal as his gaze swept over the adjacent building. There, a window slightly ajar caught his attention, not unusual in itself, except that the angle of the glass reflected the morning light in a way that made him squint. Something subtle, almost imperceptible, glimmered, a tiny mark etched along the window frame, easily mistaken for a scratch or the wear of age. But Whimsy's experience told him otherwise. The mark was deliberate, a silent signature, placed with a precision only the true orchestrator of the night's events could achieve. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, not of fear, but of anticipation. The pattern he had unraveled, the psychology he had dissected, the game he had followed to its crescendo, all suggested a mind that thrived on leaving traces. And yet, even with the villain gone, there were traces he had not yet fully decoded. Perhaps it was a breadcrumb meant for another observer, or perhaps an intentional red herring. Either way, it hinted at a continuation, a story not quite finished. As he continued down the street, Whimsy's steps echoed against the cobblestones, each footfall a metronome for his thoughts. He replayed every conversation, every interaction, the faintest inflections in voices, the hesitation of hands, the deliberate positioning of objects. The city itself seemed alive with subtle signals, a language of shadow and reflection that only a mind attuned to nuance could read. And in that language, there remained a question, quietly insistent. Threading itself through the night's events, why had the mastermind taken such pains to orchestrate the decoys, only to leave the ultimate move so tantalizingly incomplete? He stopped again, this time in a narrow passageway that led to the riverfront. The water shimmered under the rising sun, the reflections dancing like fragments of the mystery he had pursued. A discarded piece of paper floated near the edge, carried by the current in a slow, deliberate drift. Whimsy retrieved it carefully, noting the faint ink stains and the crease patterns that matched none of the known documents. It was another whisper from the absent villain, a puzzle piece that did not yet fit. Though the message was cryptic, it contained the unmistakable signature of intellect behind deliberate misdirection, a hint that the mastermind's mind had not yet left the field. He folded the paper slowly, tucking it into his coat pocket. The city's quiet morning held no answers yet, but it did hold possibility. The thrill of the hunt, the anticipation of revelation, the satisfaction of recognizing a pattern even when its conclusion remained unseen. These were the lifeblood of a detective's existence. Whimsy allowed himself a faint smile, the corners of his mouth twitching with a mixture of amusement and resolve. The case, though ostensibly concluded, was merely a chapter in a far longer narrative, one in which the threads of human cunning, obsession, and intellect wove themselves into an ever-expanding web of intrigue. Passing under an archway, he noticed a figure at the far end of the street. It was nondescript, shrouded in coat and scarf, almost as if blending into the fog itself. Yet Whimsy's eyes, trained for subtleties invisible to the ordinary observer, caught the way the figure lingered, the tilt of the head, the slight, deliberate pause in motion. A messenger, a watcher, or merely another shadow of the city's restless night? He did not yet know, but the feeling in his chest was unmistakable. The story was not finished. Each step forward carried him closer to the riverfront, where the morning light glinted off the water in fractured patterns. The city, though momentarily still, whispered of unseen movements and silent schemes. Whimsy's mind catalogued every detail, the reflections, the angles, the faint traces left in the dust and dirt of the streets. Patterns were emerging even as he walked, a subtle geometry of human behavior and intention that promised future revelation. The criminal might have escaped, but the detective's mind remained in pursuit, threading connections across space and time, mapping intentions yet unfulfilled. He paused once more on a bridge, looking down at the water flowing silently below. The ripples carried faint debris, fragments of an unseen narrative that demanded attention. Even as the city awakened, people hurrying to their routines, Whimsy felt the quiet thrill of anticipation. The game, though paused, was far from over. Somewhere out there, in the shadows or the fog, the mastermind's hand remained active, and with it, the promise of another puzzle, another challenge, another revelation. A final glance over his shoulder revealed nothing unusual, yet the detective's intuition insisted on vigilance. The case was resolved in its immediate sense. Justice, understanding, exposure of intellect. But the subtle anomalies, the faint signatures, the lingering questions suggested that another story was already taking shape, waiting for the keen observer to perceive its first moves. Whimsy straightened, adjusting his coat against the rising chill. He felt the familiar stirrings of excitement that accompanied the unknown, the thrill of mysteries yet to unfold. As he disappeared into the maze of streets, leaving behind the riverfront and its cryptic paper, the city seemed to breathe around him. A living puzzle, layered in shadow and reflection, with secrets embedded in every corner. Even as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the city's spires and rooftops, a subtle tension lingered in the air, a reminder that the world rarely grants finality. Some questions remain, some puzzles persist, and some masterminds, no matter how brilliant, leave trails that only the patient, observant mind can follow. And Whimsy, as always, was that mind. The detective walked on, each step measured, each thought deliberate, eyes scanning for irregularities invisible to all but the trained observer. Somewhere beyond the fog, a faint echo of intent awaited discovery, and he welcomed it, knowing that a mystery never truly ends. There is always another clue, another pattern, another game. And in that endless pursuit, in the quiet unraveling of secrets, the essence of his calling endured. The city pulsed with hidden possibilities, and Whimsy, solitary yet resolute, vanished into its folds, leaving behind only the faint certainty that the night's revelations were but the opening act of a far larger story yet to be written.